Hello, all of you lovely people. Jules here for WhatCulture.com, joined by the one, the only Sai.
Hey!
And also the one and completely brilliant Josh Brown.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. We are here today to answer the burning question on everyone's lips. What is your game of the year right now? Now, it might be very early doors to say this, but there have been some incredibly strong contender for that title. And so I think that we should do a little countdown and say it all together now. 3, 2, 1... Resident Evil 4 Remake. Oh, that's awful. The cross-contamination of that is going to be a nightmare for the editor to pick apart. Big love to you, friends.
Jules,
okay.
I just got a message that said, your audio is causing an issue. Please get help. So we've done something right there.
Oh, I love it. I love it as much as I love Resident Evil 4's remake. I know that it might seem very early doors to state this, but I do think that this has got Game of the Year dripping all over it. Would you agree, friends?
Go on, Sai, take it away. You have played this game to death, and I want to hear if your praise for it still holds up so many hours in.
It really does, you know. There have been moments, certainly, where I've got frustrated with it, but that's what you get for playing higher difficulties and stuff like that. And it's certainly not perfect by any measure. But as someone that, and I think I've said this before, you know, Resident Evil 4 was not my favourite game by far in the franchise, but I was like, I'm ready to love this one, and it's absolutely bowled me over. To be quite honest, and this is probably another discussion that we're going to roll into at some point, out of the Resident Evil remakes that we've had, it might well be my favourite one so far.
Sai, I love you. I love you, I really do. But don't test me. No. Resident Evil 2 remake is surely the best one. Surely it's the best one.
Sai, did we just become best friends? Did we just become best friends?
I think we did.
Because I think you're absolutely right. I loved the Resident Evil 2 remake, but it didn't get under my skin in the same way that the Resident Evil 4 remake has done it, and I wasn't expecting that. I was just talking to you two on the UB3 podcast that we've just done, and about how this game has wormed into my brain, where I'm, so invested in the world and the characters, but also my progression within that world and the kind of mechanical, what would you even describe it as? The mechanical loop that I am in terms of upgrading my weapons, getting from one area to the other in the most effective way that it is infested my brain in a way that Resident Evil 2 didn't, even though I love that as a title as well.
I'll give you that. That was
You
eloquently described it. Damn you, Josh. Why couldn't you have just said, it's better? And then I could have said, no, actually, and pushed my glasses so far up that they went into my cranium. Let's not beat around the bush. Resident Evil 4 is brilliant. It already was a fantastic game to begin with. And I may be hard-pressed to say that it's better than the original, because I would say that there's a lot of content in the original that I do miss in Resident Evil 4's remake. But in terms of how the game plays, Resident Evil has never played better than this game. The knife mechanic alone, the parry system, it should be in every single Resident Evil game going forward. As much as Sai and I discussed about how this may affect the horror tones of this, the ability to defend yourself and use it as a mechanic that has a durability allowance. Like, it's a get-out-of-jail-free card with limitations, and I love that about it.
If I could, when I was going into this game, I love Resident Evil 4, the original. I've played it to death, one of my favorite games of all time. So I had worries about the remake. I wondered how even the ability to move and shoot and move and reload at the same time would affect the tension of the gameplay. I wondered about the changes to the story and the aesthetic, whether it would be as scary and tense. And I actually find the remake to be scarier and more intense than the original. And maybe it's because I'm playing it on hardcore the first time through and I'm getting absolutely battered by all of these enemies and stuff. But I found that they've managed to maintain the tension and maintain the suspense while updating the mechanics to feel modern and to give you more power in the gameplay, like you were just talking about there, with the ability to parry with those get out of jail free cards. I find that they actually are additive to the tension, and I wasn't expecting that at all. I was expecting a straightforward action game, but every kind of change they've made, I think, is really complementary to this kind of more foreboding tone. And even though you are fighting loads of enemies, I personally still find it high intensity. I find it really scary. I find it classic survival horror in a way that I wasn't expecting, because obviously Resident Evil 4, the original, is so far removed from the original survival horror ethos. But I actually, again, maybe I'm misremembering the original, but I find this to have way more survival horror conventions than I was ever expecting it to.
That's an interesting one there. I mean, so you played the original quite recently as well, haven't you? Going through that. What do you feel like the tone comparison between the two projects is? Because I love the new graphics. Let's face it, it's one of the best looking games out there at the moment. Maybe not as facially detailed as Resident Evil 2 Remake, but still very, very good for what it is. But the graphic style, the aesthetic direction, I actually preferred in the original. I kind of like the washed out grey tones because it's like humanity's on the brink. It's you are entering the strange. Whereas here it's like rich, vibrant, beautiful. I don't know.
I do certainly get that, and to our point, I still think that the original game is scarier, and a part of that certainly comes from that, as you just described, washed out tone. That being said, there is something about the tone in the remake which is provides its own spookiness to it, right? The lighting and stuff like that. The castle looks incredibly creepy when you get in it the first time. And you were saying like the graphic fidelity, like the fog on the ground as you go in, is super old school spoopy. So in that sense, it is scary in its sort of undertone, sort of underpinning kind of way, rather than jumpy scary to me, which over a longer period of time holds out. Like, jump scares are only jump scares up to a certain point. And once, you get a bit used to it. But I think Remake 4's tone is really, for me, what I prefer over the original. And that's probably a lack of nostalgia thing, or maybe even anti-nostalgia, because when it came out, I was like, no. But yeah, I don't know. Something about it's just connected tonally with me. I also think that it might be because it's such a perfect through line now. The original 4, coming after 2 and 3, was a massive departure in almost every single way. This feels like the logical continuation of Remake 2 and 3. So that definitely helps it just feel... Something about it, despite the fact that it is spoopy tonally, there's comfortableness to it, where it's just like, yeah, this makes sense. Unlike originally, where I was like, wow, everything's different. I don't know what's going on.
It's interesting, though, because the way that you described the remake there, in terms of it's the logical step forward, we've introduced new elements, we've cut things that didn't work, it's basically positing the Resident Evil franchise to move forward with all the best bits intact. But interesting enough, you could switch out Resident Evil for the words Dead Space, and the exact same things were said about Dead Space's recent remake that I know that Josh reviewed. So the question that I have then is, which was the better remake overall? Because I see a lot of review outlets that are saying Resident Evil 4 Remake is the best remake ever. Now that's a big statement to make. Is it, Josh? Is the answer. Answer it all for us now.
Yeah, thanks, Jules. Put me on the spot. No pressure at all. Not rehearsed. When it comes to Dead Space, the remake, is an absolutely fantastic game. I loved it, but I didn't find myself, like I said, counting down the minutes to go home from work to play it. It was indebted to the original, and it was a better version of the original game, a far fancier looking version of the original game. But what I love about RE4 is that the things that it changes add to the experience, or at least make it different from the original in a really kind of felt way. Like, even though maybe the general progression is the same, just the tweaks that they've made to the gameplay allows it to play differently. Again, not to just repeat what I said in the podcast, but for example, when I was going through the village section right at the beginning, I've played that so many times, and I was expecting a kind of greatest hits run through from the remake, where I was going to do the exact same things, play more or less the exact same way, and get the same outcome. That hasn't been true. I've had to change the way I play the game. I've had to change the way I think about the game. And that, to me, is what makes it a great remake, because on the surface, not much has changed in terms of the enemies or the level design, but in terms of how you experience the enemies and level design, I think they've changed enough to make it feel fresh in a way that Dead Space would be fresh to a new player, but would feel maybe a little bit over familiar to someone who is a long-time fan or returning. And it's those almost indescribable changes in the game feel that I think makes RE4 such a fantastic remake. I think if, as we're probably going to do, compare it to RE2, you might say that's a better remake because it changed so much. It's such a radically different game from the original. It had to reinvent the wheel in a lot of different ways, and RE4 doesn't do that as substantially from the original game, in my opinion, but it's maybe a little bit smarter about what it changes and what it doesn't, and I think that's why it's a really good project and why it is, to me, more interesting and more, not to use the word sophisticated, but I can't think of a better term, sophisticated of a remake than the Dead Space one.
I think that you hit the nail on the head there with the comparison of Resident Evil 2's remake having to reinvent the wheel, and then thinking of Resident Evil 4's remake as polishing a diamond. They're two very different aspects, but both with the same brilliant outcome, because side by side, they're so different. Like, in terms of tone, in terms of resource management, like the ability, for example, to craft resources on the fly from your attaché case. If Leon had that, then it would be quite the significant change to the gameplay indeed with that. But what they've both done is set out to make horror feel different, and they've just done so in two unique and very perfect ways. I'm a huge fanboy of the Resident Evil 2 remake. I think that in terms of survival horror games out there in the wild, it is... Am I going to say it's the best? I am, I'm going to say it's the best one. I enjoy it that bloody much. But I also love Resident Evil 4. Side, what are your thoughts on that? Thoughts?
It's really hard because I want to say from a distance, but that makes it sound harsher than it is. But there is absolutely an argument I completely understand that Resident Evil 2 Remake is not only the better remake in terms of Resident Evil, but ever, because, as you say, the leaps and bounds that it had to do. I'm of the mind I would have really liked to have stayed with fixed camera angles. Resident Evil 2, the original, is my favourite game of all time. So I can't, again, like Resident Evil 4, I kind of can't decouple those feelings a little bit. When I see the remake, I'm like, it's great, but I still like this one better. So that's obviously a factor.
Sorry for cutting you off there, Si. Bloody Zoom. It's terrible. It's terrible. It's terrible. What I would say, actually, you've spurred something in my brain by saying that Resident Evil 2 is your favorite game, the original, because to me, my favorite game in the entire franchise is the Resident Evil remake, the GameCube version.
Yeah.
And to me, that's kind of more comparable to what RE4 has done, where, like you said, it's taken the core experience and it's modernized it in some aspects, but it's maintained horror. It's maintained what made the original scary, even though, kind of like RE4, that game also gave you a knife to to be able to stab zombies with when they grabbed you and stuff, and they changed some things, obviously adding the iconic crimson heads to make the kind of maybe more approachable gameplay still demanding and still incredibly tense, burning bodies, all of that stuff. And to me, this new remake is more in line with what the developers did with that, and that is my favorite game in the entire franchise. And I think it's interesting with the ability of hindsight to look at what made a game special and how can we modernize it, quote unquote, without fundamentally losing what people were interested in mechanically.
Yeah, I feel like if we look at every single Resident Evil game that's had a remake, it's so tough to determine which is, air quotes, the best, because of the fact that they all set out to achieve very different goals. Resident Evil 1's modernization of the classic is the definitive way, I'd say, to play that game. It adds in so much new content. It takes away none of the tension. It feels just as scary to play that game today as the original did to me when I was a young kid. And I'd almost say, like, if somebody said, oh, which one should I pick up? I'm almost never going to recommend the original PS1 classic. And that feels horrible to say because of, like, video game preservation, but at the same time, this is just the definitive way to play it. Resident Evil 2, I know we'll obviously be able to... It's the decoupling of ideas again. Resident Evil 2's PS1 version is amazing. Resident Evil 2 Remake's version is just amazing in itself. Everyone can agree that Resident Evil 3's remake probably is the worst, I'd say. Are we all agreed on that, at least?
Yeah, even as someone that loves it, out of the four, it's definitely going to land at the bottom no matter what. I think it's a great game, but it's Yeah, it's punching up against some giants. So
Yeah, it's the best game, but was just too short. I feel like you skip through all of the Nemesis encounters so quickly that by the time that it's gone from bin bag form to dog form to nightmare form. It's too quick. You don't get to experience the real fear that's created from those 3 different versions. And then you've got RE4's remake, which is just, it's the love letter to the franchise up until this point. It takes everything silly and pushes them to the extreme. It takes away the fat. Because, for example, there are a few sections that are missing from the original that I'm glad they cut. I, for example, hated how weird it felt to go into the furnace section of Resident Evil 4. You've got the giant dragon head floating along next to you, breathing fire. It seems so out of place to suddenly go from regal decor to lava chamber. It's like, what? What do we get rid of that? And here's hoping that maybe some of the other cut stuff may come back for the Separate Ways DLC. But when it comes to ranking all of them, we're probably going to have a difficult decision about who's at the top. But that's what we're going to do to close out this video. So, gang, at the bottom, RE3 Remake. Are we happy with that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then where?
Right, exactly. That's exactly it, because it feels really dirty to say RE2 Remake. But I almost feel like it is.
Oh, damn. I don't.
It's so wrong. It's so wrong. I understand that.
I'll put it to consensus, shall we? We'll put a voting system in place. Who believes that Resident Evil 2's remake is the third worst remake?
No, you can't put it that way.
No, but that's what it is. That's what it is, though.
I agree, but at this point, we're talking about, like Sai said, you know, some of the best of the best, some of the best to ever do it, the absolute, you know, titans of how to remake a game that has, in literally RE2, inspired a slew of survival horror games and a slew of remakes like it. You would not have the Dead Space remake if RE2 wasn't so successful.
That's true.
Despite me personally thinking it belongs in third place, that's not to undermine how good it is and what it's actually brought to the industry at large.
That's fine. I can live with it. You've again, your eloquence has just sold me on it, mate. So we go Resident Evil 3 Remake, Resident Evil 2 Remake. Okay, the 2 top spots. Are we actually putting Resident Evil 4 as the best remake in the Resident Evil franchise? Is that what we're doing?
I don't think so, despite the fact that I said it's my favourite. If someone asks me what the quintessential Resident Evil game is, I've always said it's Resident Evil for the GameCube, the HD remaster now, whatever you want to call it. That is the quintessential Resident Evil experience.
And I will back
I think it
that
always
with my
will
vote.
be.
Yep, I'm backing that with my vote too. So that's 2 for that. Are you going to join us, Josh?
Absolutely. Like I said earlier, that's my
Boom.
favorite game in the franchise. I think it's an incredible remake and game. And like Sai said, I think it's just like a great thing to hold up and say. It's interesting because that is one era of Resident Evil encapsulated. And I think the RE4 remake is another era of Resident Evil encapsulated. So it kind of depends which era you prefer, I suppose. And for me, it's the first one.
So there we have it then. The official, unofficial What Culture ranking of all of the Resident Evil remakes has go like this. Resident Evil 3 Remake, Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and at the very tippy top, it's the Resident Evil 1 Remake. Therefore, we can put out the title for this video, whereas every other review outlet is saying Resident Evil 4 is the greatest remake ever, we say it is not the greatest remake ever, even within its own franchise.
Scott Tailford's coming back from Japan and going, look how you massacred my boy. What have you done while I'm away? How did you possibly let this out?
He's going to be the "this is fine" dog, isn't he?
Yeah. Hey, listen, if the fans have listened to us warble on this long enough, they'll understand where we're coming from, and I'm sure that they're not going to have vitriolic responses saying you are wrong.com. So here we go. That's our ranking. I hope that you enjoyed our little chat about Resident Evil 4's remake. A great game, but perhaps not the greatest. Let us know what you thought about it down in the comment section below. And gang, I believe it is time now to plug those social media aspects. So take it away.
At Syniac_123.
And Joshy boy.
At Josh Brown with 2 O's in the Brown.
Oh yes, and you can follow me at RetroJ, but the O is a 0 on both Instagram and Twitter. That's been it from us today. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.